Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to week 5 of COVID-19, My Business, What Do I Need to Do? This is your one-stop shop for all business advice, national and local government support packages that could be available to you to support all businesses across the Humber area who may be self-employed, sole traders, or an SME business. So as we enter this new week, we're all currently waiting to find out what Boris Johnson's roadmap out of lockdown will be. So we all wait for that on Sunday. Whilst we wait for that, we need to start thinking about preparing about how we can recover our businesses. So we've started to adjust our agenda of support this week to move more towards how you can get ready to socially distance back in the workplace, how you can look at some of the other schemes that are available to support you in your endeavours to do that. Joining me as always, we have Peter Daniel. He's going to talk to you about national support schemes that are available to your businesses. If you haven't heard about these yet, this will be good information for you to know about. If you have heard of it, if you've logged on to these sessions before, this will be a recap for you. And if you haven't taken advantage of these schemes, Peter will be able to outline for you how they can benefit you. Then taking us through key financial and legal information that you should be considering at this moment in time. Hopefully you've had a recovery plan in place now to keep your business going. So now looking forwards, looking about returning back to work, getting your operations back to normal. We have Mike Byrne, accountant and Blue Orchid business advisor. We'll talk to you about all matters financial and legal. Then providing us with a HR guidance update and furloughing facts and a variety of other facts related to employment law. We have Kelly Calvert, Director of Humber HR People, talking to you about how you're going to manage your staff in terms of managing them effectively, as well as managing them in terms of employment law through this next process of returning back to work, as well as managing them during lockdown. Then covering business continuity, preparing for lockdown easing and providing you with an update on local business support. We have Steve Page, Director of Page Consulting, who will run through all those points with us. And then finally, we're going to look at managing mental health for employees and yourself. We've been having this session now for the last couple of weeks, run by Rachel Alexander, Director of I Can Handle It, making sure that we look after one of the most important assets of the business, which is our staff. As always, if you've been on these sessions before, you'll know to use the question function. So we'll deliver these presentations now over the next hour and 40 minutes or so. Please use the questions function on your dashboard to ask any questions throughout, any questions of clarity, any specific questions relating to your business. We're here to answer your questions today, all in one go. So please log them, and when we finish the presentations, we'll address each and every one of them before we finish today's workshop. That will be in our full panel Q&A session at the end. Now, before I hand over to Peter, we have one person missing today, and that's Stella Jacobs, who normally runs through our cybersecurity. And for those that saw the government announcement last night, Dominic Raab explained about how important cybersecurity cover is at the moment, and how we've seen a massive increase in cyber attacks recently. And I was just having a read before today's session to look at that. There's a variety of phone scams, Facebook scams, email scams going on. The FTC in America said that there's been over 13 million consumers been affected by COVID-related scams just from January this year. Our government suggests that you need to make sure that you're covered, whether you're a sole trader, a self-employed person, or an SME business. And you can get some really good advice from the National Cybersecurity Centre, and you can see the website on your screen there. So please do check that out for this week to have a look at what advice and guidance they give you to make sure you cover yourselves. Next week, Stella will be back joined with us to run through this in detail, to give you some very practical advice, guidance and steps to take to make sure you're covered. But one thing that she's asked me to do this week, to make sure you all do, is bob on to howsecureismypassword.net. This will test how secure your password is to make sure you've got yourself covered from that perspective, to make sure that you've not got a password that you've not changed for a while that's quite easy or open to be hacked. So do have a quick check of those links after today's event. Both very useful, will both help protect you from cyber attacks in your business. That's it from me for now. So I shall now hand you over to Peter Daniel to talk about the national support available. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that. So I'm just going to go through very quickly about the various support schemes that are available. And in particular, I want to talk about two. There's two of the ones which had some changes over the last sort of few days. So I want to talk about those. The very first one is the support for self-employed. So this was announced a few weeks ago, and I'm sure you all know about that one. This is where self-employed people will receive 80% of profits for 3 months in June, is what they said. In June is what they said. Now, the really good news on this one, they are ahead of schedule. They're ahead of schedule for these payments. So there is an eligibility checker now up live. So it's go on, check your eligibility. I have heard reports today, because it's only just gone live, that there are people coming back as ineligible for no apparent reason. So there may be some bugs within this. There certainly was some bugs within some of the other eligibility checkers when they got launched. So this might well be the same. But basically, that is now up and running, and they expect the first payments to be on around about the 21st of May. So that's the first group of people may well start to see payments the 21st of May. So realistically, a week or more advance to what they actually predicted. So it's really, really good news, especially for some people who may be struggling at this time. So just to recap what that one is. So it's for anybody who's self-employed who has done a 2019 tax return. So the tax return you should have done in January this year. As long as over 50% of your income is self-employed and your profits do not exceed £50,000, you should be eligible for this. You should be eligible for this. And you should get a grant, and it is a taxable grant of 80% of the profits once this comes about, which, as I say, as I've always been saying, is June. So it's looking like it's going to be certainly early part of June, if not the end of May. So really, really good news there. Key thing here, I've put this in bold on this one, you can still work and claim this one. So if you're self-employed, go out and try and earn as much as you can, because you're getting 80%, so you can top that up to that full 100%. The next one I'm going to talk about is bounce back loans. So this is the new one mentioned last week, but it went live on Monday, so we've got a lot more information about this one. So what is that one? Well, this one is kind of in response to the fact that a lot of people were saying that the business interruption loans were taking too long. They were too difficult to apply for. So this is the kind of quick and easy version. It's really aimed at the smaller end. So it's for loans of 2,000 to 50,000. So 2,000 to 50,000, or 25% of your turnover, whichever one is less. It's meant to be a really easy access for this one, like a 2-page form. Actually, we had somebody on a workshop this morning. They've applied for this and received the money already, because they expect the payment to be within 24 hours. This only went live on Monday at 9 o'clock. And as I say, we've already had one client who's actually accessed this and received the payment. So what else do we know about this one? Well, it's an unsecured loan from your point of view. It is a business loan, so it is still a loan. You still have to pay it back, but it is unsecured. The first 12 months are interest-free. So as long as you make the capital repayments, you do not pay any interest. What that basically means is if you can pay it back within 12 months, it is essentially a free loan. Remember, you've got to pay it back. The total term for the loan is 6 years. So that's 12 months interest-free. It's 5 years with the interest, and the interest rate is 2.5%. Now, one of the things I'm going to really point out here is they have said you can use it to pay off existing finance. So if you have existing finance, which is higher than the 2.5%, check whether there's any penalties to pay it off early. If there isn't any penalties to pay it off early, you may well be worthwhile taking this bounce back loan, paying off your finance, so you've got a lower rate of finance. Now, this applies to any finance, including people who are on things like startup loans. They have confirmed that you can use it to pay off startup loans, but you need to bear in mind what your payment charges are at the moment and whether there's any early redemption fees there. So really, really good loan there. As I say, it seems to be working. Now, how do you apply for this one? Well, it is applied through the banks. It is the banks that have the go ahead on this one, and that's one of the reasons they can do it so quickly and they can get these payments in so quickly. Not all banks are doing it currently. So I've got a list here, and I'm afraid to refer to some notes here for that list of banks of who are doing it. So we know at the moment that the Bank of Scotland are doing it, Barclays are doing it, Clydesdale Bank are doing it, Danske Bank are doing it, HSBC, Lloyds Bank, NatWest, RBS, Santander, TSB, Ulster Bank and Yorkshire Bank. Those are confirmed at the moment. I know a lot of people will bank with people like Starling. Now, Starling Bank have confirmed that they will be doing it, but they're not in a position to offer it currently. So hopefully that will come in the next few weeks or few days, hopefully. For most people, you have to bank with that bank to be able to access it. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a business account with that bank, but you do, for most of them, have to have an account with it because they're looking at your history on part here. As I say, have a word, have a chat with the banks. Some are, if you don't bank with any of those, some are taking on new customers for this one as well. So it's not completely just that for people who bank with those banks at the moment. There are some, but it is more of a limited choice. But whatever, it's the same interest rate, whichever bank you go to, the same application process. So realistically, it shouldn't matter which one you go to. Other things, as I say, I've mentioned in the past are things like the VAT return deferment, well, VAT payment deferment and the tax deferment. So if you're trying to eke out that cash flow, it does mean that you can defer your payment to January 2021 for your tax. And that you can use that until some of these monies come in place. Now, it is a deferment, so you still have to pay it back. So just make sure you do replenish that when one of these payments come in. Business loan interruption scheme. Now, this is the one that was announced, and that is the largest scheme to the bounce back loans. For anybody who has actually applied for this and now think the bounce back loans might be a better option, you can ask for your application to be transferred to a bounce back loan from the business loan interruption scheme. So again, really, really good news. Finally, business rates relief. If you're in one of the sectors that have been, I'm going to say, severely impacted, which covers a lot of businesses now, retail, hospitality, nurseries, anything like that, you will get automatic reductions in your business rates to 0 for the 2020 to 2021 season. For those as well who have, again, had your income severely impacted, there is also universal credit. So there is support through the job centre. And a couple of things I'm going to say here. You can still be self-employed and claim universal credit. The key thing though is when you apply for universal credit, you do not say your business has stopped. Otherwise, they will want proof that it stopped. You'll say that you are still continuing the business so that you can start when everything kind of gets back on track. So do say that one. Times of application are coming down. They're getting back on top of this sort of large influx of people they had last month, so times are coming down. So what is universal credit? Well, universal credit basically will flex with your income. So at the moment, you may not be earning anything, you may not be earning very much. Well, what will happen is you'll gain more universal credit because of that. As time goes by, as your employment increases again, your self-employment increases again, and your business increases again, that universal credit will come down as profits increase. So it's that flexible amount that you'll be able to get. One of the things I'd suggest to everybody, go online to the .gov.uk website, have a look at the eligibility checker on there for any of the support in terms of the universal credit, income support, things like that, and that will tell you what you're entitled to. That will tell you what you're entitled to. That's really the main update from myself. And as I say, the thing I wanted to kind of push here as much as the business bounce back loans, and how they can be used for businesses to help them in the coming months. We've got a long way to go in this one. We've got to get the economy back on target, there's going to be lots of changes. There's going to be lots of pressure on businesses, even once lockdown is lifted. So reducing your overheads is one thing you're going to need to look at. And using these business bounce back loans to look at other finance could be a really, really good way of reducing down your monthly overheads. But thank you very much. I'll be able to answer any questions towards the end.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. And just a reminder to everybody, as Peter went through all those national programs there, all those different changes that are happening at the moment, we're dealing with them every day, and we're supporting and advising clients on how they can access what they can access. So if you'd like to know how any of those schemes could apply to you, or if you feel that you'd like just to check your circumstances, today's the day you can ask that question. Please log your questions on the questions panel or portal, sorry, and Peter will be able to answer them for you later on in the session. So now we'll pass you over to Mike Byrne, and Mike's going to talk to us about all matters legal and financial. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Peter, for that comprehensive rundown of the schemes that the government's introduced to help at a time of not only health crisis, but financial crisis, and deal with the economic impact of the coronavirus. And I really want to spend some time drawing away from that to the whole situation of the financial position you might be in. In a sense, there are two types of business. There are those that are carrying on in some way, or even completely the way that they were before the business interruption of the Covid-19. And there are those businesses that have actually had to close. You would think they fall into two camps for lots of reasons, but in fact, both category of business can be affected by indebtedness, can be affected by not having enough cash flowing into the business, having bills to pay, and trying to stay afloat, trying to avoid insolvency and trying to get through this whole situation. And it's easy to see the direct impact of something like a bounce back loan, or something like a grant if you have a shop, that is going to immediately inject cash into the business. And my 3-point strategy remains that you should think about the economic impact on your business and how this current situation is affecting you. Take immediate action, and then take a look at what the future will hold. And that's what I'm going to follow through in the next few minutes to talk through. So if I can have my next slide, please, Paul, thank you. So assessing the economic impact will be different for different businesses, but I've kept an eye, and I'm sure you have, on the way things are going by looking at some of the evidence, looking at statistics, because otherwise you're just really taking a punt as to what is happening. I think it's more important than ever to get absolute clarity about how the sector that you're in is being affected by the current economic climate. And the data I've got is updated, but there is a lag. So we're looking sometimes at information from the very start of the coronavirus outbreak, as we are at the beginning. In the first 2 weeks or so, we saw the massive impact on certain sectors. So I've said consumer confidence has been shattered there in the first. It's an extreme view of it, but if you look at the sectors like restaurants, pubs, and mass gatherings, football stadium, that kind of thing, you can see 84% of people not happy with the idea of going back into a stadium or a concert venue. And those kind of businesses have to take a really long, hard look at their business model. That's further reinforced by the British Independent Retailers Association calling this the worst crisis they've ever encountered, with 20% of stores intending to remain closed after the current restrictions are lifted. That's an indication of either the inability to get back into business, or more hopefully, the opportunity maybe to find a different way of doing business. There's a statistic there about the coronavirus business interruption loan scheme, which was primarily used by larger businesses, and the lack of take-up led to the bounce back loans being introduced this week. 100,000 businesses applied for loans on the first day. And Paul has mentioned the kind of roadmap out of lockdown coming on Sunday, we hope. Well, that will be supported by the results of a consultation exercise that the government carried out with businesses to actually see sector for sector how businesses can get out of the current restrictions, lockdown as we call it, and move on from that. And the information about that and about all the government support can be found on gov.uk, and especially find coronavirus support. Now that is the new package, that is the new place for all the information about government support. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So in that climate, what's the immediate action you can take? And I want to address something very specific now, very specific. Use the word debt. It's a word that you can use like for like with borrowing, with loans, with things outstanding. You know, in business, when you're running a business and you accumulate debts, it's extraordinarily stressful for someone running a business who is accustomed to being able to see the payments and receipts being carefully managed in their business. There are always two sides to this problem, and one is the income coming into the business. Well, take the help that's on offer. Not everyone does. Take that help. Some people will be taking help from the government that they've never envisaged they would ever need to take, and their mindset isn't necessarily suited for that. But basically, we're all in a very difficult position here, and the government, the state, has a role to help businesses through this. That help will maximize your income and therefore reduce the problem, increase your ability to pay the debts that you have to pay. It's really important to take control of the situation if you think you're running out of money. I know that sounds obvious, but there are things that you have to pay before others. And what I'm going to talk about shortly is what takes priority. What should you do first? We'll come to that in a second. But another way you can improve your situation is to make contact with all the organizations or businesses that you do owe money to. Explain the situation. They won't be surprised. They'll be encountering this on a daily basis now, where their customers or their clients cannot pay for services or for products. You can usually work with reasonable creditors. I've talked about voluntary arrangements in a general sense there. In terms of keeping a business afloat, a formal voluntary arrangement may be entered into with legal backing. That's something that you might consider. And I know it sounds like a cliche, but I have said, and maybe we're going to talk or hear a bit more about the mental health issues on this. Personal bankruptcy or winding up a company, I've described it as not the end of the world. It certainly is a personal tragedy and disaster, and almost feels like the end of everything for people who encounter, say, bankruptcy. And I'm not going to suggest there isn't a long list of things you then can't do, and they do affect your ability to run in business. But you have to make sure you see the difference between you and your business. You know, there are other things you can do, but some, in fact, many people who encounter business failure go on to start again and go on to do better and to enjoy life much better than they did with their previous business. One thing I will say then to people who are either fear or are experiencing indebtedness in their business, think it's kind of looking bleak, is to get the professional advice that is out there and is available. And I would point you in the direction of Business Deadline. businessdeadline.org is their website. And Business Deadline is a charity that has a range of services and information for people who are experiencing business debts. It's an offshoot of a wider organization called National Deadline, and their experience of handling situations where people get into indebtedness is extraordinary. And they are a very good organization, and the information that you will need, even if you're only sort of approaching the thought of having problem debts, is absolutely wonderful on their website. Immediately then take control. But I think we can look further ahead. And in order to get there, you're going to have to look, I think, at the things that are most important priorities for resolving indebtedness. Can I have the next slide, please, Paul? And the list here is unfortunately a long one of priority debts. You know, I'm not, again, trying to sugar the pill here, that if you owe money, you owe it and it has to be managed. This is why I say take control and face up to it. But having said that, if you look at this list of priority debts, they are always things where there is a sanction at the end that is particularly painful. That's what really makes them show up on this list of priority debts, things that must be faced first. And if it's not on the list, it's something you may have to treat differently and maybe try and pay over a longer term than immediate settlement of some of these priority debts. So what are they? Well, rent and rates, where you can be evicted from premises, although we know that there is now relief for that until the end of June. Heat, light and water, the utilities, where you can be disconnected. But again, you have to have 7 days notice. That gives you some breathing space. But this is where I really would argue that being in touch with your creditors and working with them is an absolutely vital part of helping you get over indebtedness and maybe coming out the other side. You will have heard that there is an opportunity to delay the payment of income tax and VAT. Of course, the sanction for not paying your taxes is heavy on the part of HMRC, but as an accountant of many years, I can tell you that in terms of time to pay, they act as a very reasonable organization indeed. Hire purchase means the repossession of goods. Well, if you haven't paid a third of the purchase price, but some goods are more important than others. So for the next 4 items, priority only really amounts to some elements of these debts. So some things on hire purchase are a priority, other things maybe are not. As I could say the same about major suppliers. You don't want to lose a supplier of essential goods and services to your business. And so if they're essential, they're on that list of priority debts. Same with business loans, where there is a form of security. An unsecured loan would not be a priority debt, but a bank can terminate banking services for a business, even if it defaults on an unsecured loan. And you wouldn't expect me not to mention professional fees and the consequences of that. It's often been shown that accountants are the first port of call for financial advice on the part of businesses. You don't want to have a poor relationship there. I just point out that although your accountant can keep work that they have prepared on your behalf and you haven't paid for, they're not allowed to keep your own documents like invoices and receipts. They would have to be returned to you. So I thought it might be useful to go through what are considered to be priority debts. Business debt line doesn't talk about secondary or anything less than priority debts. It talks about all debts, but in the context of all indebtedness, there are more important things than others. Can I have the next slide, please, Paul? And I just think this is the last thing I want to say. And it's because if I left it at that and just talked about indebtedness, you would think that that's it, that this should be all about insolvency and about winding up a business and closing it down. And I could talk a lot about that, but I'd rather focus on the fact that managed correctly, managed in conjunction with creditors, owing money, being in debt in the business can be something that you can manage through. It's also an indication maybe that it's the time to think about restarting, reconsidering your business and how you do business, because you could argue something has gone wrong and it needs to be put right. Now, I'm not going to take away from what Steve will talk about in terms of business recovery, but I'll just simply use an expression that I think is very similar in the health field to stay home, save lives, which is if you want to reconstruct your business, then the process you go through is one of research, planning and management. And these simple phrases are helpful in a time of crisis when it's hard to think clearly about what you should do. So if you're thinking of dealing with debt and you're thinking of getting out of debt and starting your business up again or starting a new business, then think about the options for the way you can change your business. Think about how you manage the fact that perhaps there will be a change that some of your existing customers will have noticed, because your reputation is very important as far as the business is concerned. Once you've actually gone through that consideration of information, then the next stage will be to plan your restart. And I want to emphasize the financial part of that, that you use grants, loans, and your own money in the right mix, in the right way. And just one point about the future business. If you had a hard time in business and it ended up in an unsatisfactory way, including financially running into debts, it's hard then to get the enthusiasm back for the same thing, but maybe you can. So I think that's the last consideration. Is this future business one that you are a good match with in terms of your temperament, so that you can manage the business? Because all the research and information, all the preparation and planning will count for nothing if you don't then manage the business through to a better, more successful return for yourself. So I hope that is a useful adjunct to talking about the support that might come into your business, to think about the way that money should go out of your business in a way that constructively takes you forward for the future. So thank you, and that's the last thing I'm going to say, Paul. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. Thank you again for another insightful presentation. And just to remind everybody watching today that some of the points that Mike goes through there are very practical elements of what you might need to do moving forward for your businesses. We'll hear some more today from our other specialists about this and what you need to prepare for. However, moving forward, the Grow My SME program, sponsored by the Humber Growth Hub, will be looking at putting on future workshops. So I remind everybody to please keep checking the Growth Hub website for further support, workshops, and one-to-one to help you through some of the elements that Mike and some of our other specialists will talk about today. But moving swiftly on, I shall pass you on to our specialist employment law consultant, Kelly Calvert, who's now going to talk to you. So I'll put your slide on, Kelly. About furloughing and employment law. Over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Okay, so today I just want to cover off again some common questions that we've been receiving and do a bit more of a deep dive into redundancies and kind of tips that you need to be mindful of, and then also look at some kind of practical tips as we look to go into this kind of eased out of lockdown approach that we're all sort of poised and waiting for the announcement for on Sunday. So to start off with then, with regards to furlough, a lot of the questions that we're having at the moment are around sort of how people can make claims. So how we be reimbursed. You can actually log on to the portal once every 3 weeks at least. You need to calculate the amount that you're going to be reclaiming. So that can be up to 80% of somebody's salary, which is capped at $2,500 per month. You do need to make those calculations yourself, and you do need to make sure that you're keeping records of those calculations for each employee, okay? Do I need to get employers to agree to furlough? Yes, you do. Again, that needs to be in writing, and you need to keep a record of that on file for 5 years. Another question that we're getting is around how do I select employees for furlough leave? This is a bit of a grey area because you can leave yourself open to discrimination claims if you are going through a process of having to reduce the size of your workforce and some staff are going on furlough and some are remaining in the workplace. The best approach to take with this, if it's not a particular group of jobs that are no longer at use, but you're actually reducing down the size of the group of people that are doing a particular job, is to take the same approach as you would within a redundancy process. So really focus on the skills and the performance of individuals and put together a scoring matrix that you're going through that process, scoring individuals and keeping those individuals who score the highest within the workplace. So you have a selection criteria to base your decisions upon. Do I need to pay 100% of wages in order to claim through the job retention scheme? No, you don't. You only need to pay up to 80% of wages. And if you choose to top up to 100%, you can't claim that differential back. Do you need to meet the minimum wage guidelines when you pay 80%? No, you don't, because those only apply for when people are actually working. So an employee who's on furlough isn't working, so you don't need to make sure that they hit national minimum wage. It's just 80% of what their earnings would be. Can an employee undertake any work during furlough? The answer to this question is no, they can't, for their employer who's placed them on furlough. So if you employ somebody, you place that person on furlough, they cannot undertake any work for you during that period. They can go and work for another employer if you give them permission. And if you do that, then you need to obviously state to them that once the furlough period is finished, they need to make themselves available to fulfill their contract with yourselves. I know somebody asked last week around charity workers and if they were able to volunteer for their employer if they've been placed on furlough. The answer to that question is still no. Even charity workers are not able to volunteer or work or engage in any kind of services for the employer who has placed them on furlough. With regards to sick leave, we're getting a lot of questions around this and sort of the different scenarios. If you have an employee who is on long-term sick, you can choose to move that employee onto furlough leave if you wish, and they agree to it. If you have an employee who is self-isolating because they have a shielding letter, you can place that employee on furlough leave if they agree to it as well. If you have employees who are self-isolating for 7 to 14 days, they should be placed on statutory sick pay. So they will be eligible for statutory sick pay from day 1 and up to 14 days. And you as an employer can claim up to 14 days back. And that will be available through an HMRC website. I don't think it's actually launched as yet, but details of that will be coming shortly. Do I need to have a home working policy if people are working from home? I think the answer to this is yes. I mean, it's not a legal requirement, but best practice is that you do have a home working policy. I think that's really becoming more important now, because I think we need to kind of drop the temporary word, because this is going to be something that's going to be sort of, I think, more of a permanent fixture in the way that we work, definitely from now sort of throughout the end of the year and potentially into next year. So you really do need to focus on, you know, what a good home working policy looks like, and that would include things like who provides the equipment, who is responsible for maintaining the equipment, what would happen if any equipment is broken, the fact that as an employer you are still entitled to monitor the use of that equipment. So I'm not insinuating that your staff would be using that equipment inappropriately in their home, but you do need to have regulations in place so that if something does happen, you know how you're going to deal with it. It would also cover off things around utilities. So if you're going to be allowing people to claim the cost of their internet or utility bills back by their expenses, you need to make that very clear. So it is good to have a home working policy, so it's very transparent and everybody knows what they're entitled to or what the kind of the requirements are. We're also getting a lot of questions around redundancies, and I'm going to cover this more off in the next slides, so I'll go into more detail around consultation processes then. If anybody does have any questions around some of the points I've just touched on, please feel free to pop them in the question box and we can answer those at the end of my presentation or the end of the full presentation. But if we can move on to the next slide, please. So redundancy, I wanted to give a bit more of a deep dive overview into some of the things that you need to be mindful of if you do find yourself in a situation where you have to make redundancies. A redundancy situation exists where a business or part of a business is completely shut down, and whether that's in a location, even if it's opening up into a new location, or whether the requirement for employees to do work of a particular kind has reduced or come to an end. So that's kind of the definition of if you find yourself in a redundancy situation. If you're going to dismiss 20 or more employees within a 90-day period or less, then you need to complete an HR1 form to notify the government that you are making those redundancies. If you are going to make redundancies and it's for 20 or more employees in one establishment, then you do need to consult with appropriate representatives. Now, appropriate representatives can be union reps if you're in a unionised environment, or if you're not in a unionised environment, you don't already have an employee forum in place or some kind of formally recognised body in place, then you do need to go through a process of electing appropriate representatives. So you just need to be mindful of that when you are kind of planning out your redundancy journey, that you need to elect those members before you can commence any consultation periods. If we can go to the next slide, please. So where there is fewer of 20 redundancies proposed, you're not required to consult collectively. However, it is really good practice to consult individually. And this really is to demonstrate that you're following a fair process, because you can leave yourself open to unfair dismissal claims if you don't follow a fair and transparent process. So it really is good practice, even though you're not legally required to actually consult if you're making redundancies of 20 or less employees. If you're making redundancies for 20 to 99 employees, then you need to consult for a minimum of 30 days. Or if it's 100 or more employees, it's increased to 45 days. And you do need to have those periods of consultation before you issue any notices of termination or dismissal, okay? So you do need to make sure you observe that full consultation period. The consultation period needs to be meaningful. And by that, it needs to mean that you can allow your employees to influence the process. So ways in which to avoid dismissals or reduce the number of people that are being dismissed or mitigate those kind of consequences of the dismissal. So that consultation does need to be meaningful, and it needs to start at the beginning of that journey. Next slide, please. As I say, avoid making any notices of dismissals before you've concluded that consultation process, because it can leave you open to unfair dismissal claims. When you do make dismissals, you do need to be mindful of notice periods. So any employee that is given notice of redundancy, they will have a contractual notice period, but also a statutory notice period. And it is whichever is the greater of the two that you need to observe. So for example, somebody might have a 4-week notice period, but they've actually been employed for 8 weeks. So the statutory notice period would be 8 weeks, and that's the notice period that you need to observe. On the other side of it, if they have a contractual notice period of 4 weeks and they've only been employed for 3 years, it's the 4-week notice period that takes precedence. So it's that longer notice period of the two. Throughout a redundancy process and during a time that an employer is at risk, you do have the duty to notify all members of any employment opportunities that you may have. So you do need to think about methods and ways to make sure that that is communicated out to all staff. Again, if you don't, then you could put yourself at risk of unfair dismissal claims. Once notice has been issued to somebody who is being made redundant, they do have the right to reasonable paid time off to look for other work or undertake training. So it's another thing that you need to be mindful of. We can have the next slide, please. Anybody who is selected for redundancy does have the right to appeal against that decision. So the normal dismissal rules apply. They do have the right to appeal. So you would write to them to say that you're making them redundant, and you would give them perhaps a 7 or a 10-day notice period in which to submit a written appeal to you on the grounds of which they feel the redundancy was unfair. Any employee who has 2 years service at the date of termination is entitled to statutory redundancy pay. So just make sure that you do bear that in mind when it comes to sort of calculating any costs. Redundancy pay is kind of a statutory formula that is based on length of service, age, and their weekly pay. And you can go online on the HMRC website, and there is a tool that you can use that will calculate that for you. As well, you do have an option as an employer to top up redundancy pay, and that can be topped up tax-free to an amount of 30,000. So just bear that in mind as well if you're in a position to be able to make those top-up payments. If you do have any questions around redundancy, please do feel free to pop them in the question box, and I can cover those off at the end. One thing I would say is that with regards to any redundancy process, it is worthwhile investing in getting some expert help and advice, because if you don't follow the process, you could leave yourself open to sort of unfair dismissal claims, discrimination claims. It is kind of a really dangerous path to go down if you're not sure what you're doing. So do make sure that you get that advice. Next slide, please. So thinking about the return to normal, if we can call it normal, obviously we're all waiting for this announcement on Sunday to kind of give us a bit more information on what this ease out of lockdown is going to look like. But I think from an employer's point of view, you need to start thinking practically around how that is going to impact your workplace and what you really need to start putting in place. And I think from an employee point of view, the real important thing is training. You need to be kind of clear as to what the implications are going to be for your workplace and how you're going to train your staff before they come back into the workplace, so that they are fully aware of all the measures that you've had to implement in order to keep everybody safe. So you need to kind of think of this as an induction, so inducting people back into the workplace. Things to consider around kind of staggered shift times, reduce or sort of exclude all kind of hot desking, sharing of equipment, potentially closing canteens, or where you can, maybe offering sort of pre-prepared food that people can kind of queue up to get to, keeping employees apart during break times, prohibiting face-to-face meetings. I think we've all kind of got into this virtual landscape now, so that should be easier. In sort of continuing with travel restrictions, again, we've kind of all got into this world of virtual reality, so those kinds of things should be quite easy to maintain. Potentially looking at, you know, maybe introducing more car parking spaces so that people, if they do car share, don't have to do that going forwards. And then more importantly, I think the monitoring of mental health and also physical health of staff. So, you know, what kind of services and support are you going to provide? As well, you need to think about kind of high levels of deep cleaning, because we know that is going to be something that the employers do need to consider, is how you're going to make sure that your workplaces are clean and sanitised. So if you do need to engage the services of external companies, it would probably be worthwhile investigating and getting those relationships going now, because there is going to be quite a requirement for that going forwards. And then obviously PPE. So if you are in a situation where you can't put social distancing measures in place, you know the likelihood is that you are going to need to provide PPE to keep your staff safe. So it's making sure that you're able to access that. So those really are some kind of hints and tips, but I think the overarching thing is, where people can work from home, is to try and maintain that as much as possible. So if you have any questions on anything that I've covered this afternoon, please feel free to pop them in the questions box, and I can pick them up at the end. But thank you for your time.
That's great. Thanks again to Kelly and the entire team of Humber HR people, who have been absolutely excellent over the last few weeks, providing us with the information that we need. So big thanks, Kelly, to you and the team there. Humber HR. Moving swiftly on, I can just see that we have started to get some questions coming in now, so please keep your questions coming in based on any of our presenters' presentations. Do keep asking your questions. We will get round to answering every one of them in the Q&A session at the end. I will now pass you over into the capable hands of Steve Page from Page Consulting.
Thank you, Paul. What I'd like to do, if we could have the opening slide, Paul, thank you, is just talk a little bit about business continuity, or keeping your business running, or if it's not running currently, how to get it back up and running again in a successful and sustainable way. So really what I wanted to do was build on some of the excellent tips and real practical advice that you've heard from Peter, from Mike, and also from Kelly. Because all of what they've been saying fits into the framework of business continuity. So we're going to have a little look at what it is, how you can start to use it to your advantage, particularly as we're now reaching that stage where the initial lockdown is starting to come to an end, and we need to be thinking about preparing for that lockdown easing, the restriction removal or easing. I know there's a route map coming sometime in the near future. Hopefully the early communications of that will start to emerge as of Sunday. But I suspect that that will be a roadmap on a national level. And what you need to be doing is then looking at that and translating that into what does it mean for you and your business and the particular circumstances that you find yourself in, and the sectors that you're working in and how they might be affected for the future. And I'll briefly touch just on at the end some of the support that's available to complement the national programs, which Peter has outlined earlier, to have a little look at the support that's available from the Humber Business Growth and signpost you onto their website, where there's some really detailed and excellent information And there's also the ability for you to connect up to the teams of business advisors that are part of that hub. So if we could have the next slide, please, Paul. So for those of you who have attended these drop-in sessions before, this will be a little bit of a refresher for you, although I'm going to be focusing more on what this means for the future as we go into lockdown easing. And for those of you who are coming on for the first time, I'll just give you a little bit of an insight in terms of what business continuity planning is and why it's so important. So fundamentally, business continuity planning is a methodology, a system that is used to help businesses manage risk. And really that old adage of to be forewarned is to be forearmed absolutely applies here. You'll know yourself from whenever an incident has occurred, if you've just seen it coming, just that little bit before it hit you, you could have done things which would have eased its impact, if not completely prevented it from occurring. And that little golden window of time can be so important to helping you to deal with situation upon situation, particularly where that impact could be quite damaging to the business or individuals associated with it, if not its reputation. So I think it was Sir Charles Darwin who said that it's not the strongest or the most intelligent of the species that survive, it's the ones who are most able to adapt. And never was a truer word spoken about business, let alone the natural world. So business continuity planning really is a structured methodology to help you bit by bit look at what you need to do to adapt to the changes that you and your business are experiencing. And adapt in a clever, effective and rapid way so that you remain able to continue to operate or get back on your feet very, very quickly if an impact has been quite severe. So basically, I'll be talking you through some of the steps that are involved in that process, which is fundamentally looking at creating systems for prevention as well as recovery. Prevention is always better than cure, and therefore we need to see what we can do to either mitigate the risk altogether or at least minimize the impact on us if it were to come through. And then secondly, how we get back on our feet again very quickly in order to be able to ensure that we can continue to function. Maybe not as we did before, but in a way that is most appropriate, having adapted to the changes in the environment that we're in. So, it sounds very complicated. It isn't. It's simply a series of steps that you can follow. The real key to this isn't you creating a very comprehensive, detailed master plan. The benefit comes from you taking the time out to step back from your business and just fundamentally think about what sorts of risks or threats the business might be exposed to in the future and how you deal with those. And then to put some things in place such that if they did happen, you're ready for them and able to cope. That's all it. That's all there is to it. So if you're a small, little, simple business, you just need a relatively simple, lightweight plan, but it's focusing on the things that really matter. If you're a large, global, international business that's in an industry where the supply chains are absolutely committed to high levels of business resilience and continuity of supply, whether that's medical services, food, power, whatever they are, then you will have a much more comprehensive business continuity plan that goes into things in a lot more detail and has an awful lot of resource available to support it when these things occur. So depending upon your own particular circumstances, you may have an easier or more difficult challenge ahead, depending upon those circumstances. There's a lot of information about business continuity planning. There's an international standard on it, which is 22301. So please go and Google that up and have a little look at it if you want to know the real nitty-gritty insights and details associated with the full rigor of applying that standard. So fundamentally, an organization's resistance to failure, its resilience, is what we're trying to achieve. And that's defined as its ability to withstand changes in its environment and still continue to function. It may not continue to function in the way that it continued before, but it's able to continue to function having adapted to the circumstances that it now finds itself in, and is therefore able to provide those services and products that are appropriate to its situation. So I hope that's just giving you a little bit of an insight into what it is, without frightening you off into some sort of really sophisticated, overcomplicated planning process. It doesn't have to be any more complicated than you need it to be. And in fact, the simpler it is, the easier it is to use, and the more effective you're likely to find it to be. So if we could just move on to the next slide. So part of being able to be really effective in terms of your dealing with a crisis is to provide effective planning, to step back and fundamentally think, what is it I need to do in the future to be able to cope with a variety of situations that may or may not present themselves to me. And don't forget, in the context of COVID-19, I don't think any organisation has ever had to deal with the severity and the complexity that we're finding on a global level that the COVID-19 outbreak is bringing to us. So really, really unprecedented times, which will mean even the best contingency plans may not be quite as optimized as you might like them to be, because you would never ever have predicted the sort of situations occurring like you are doing now. So that flexibility and adaptability will always be a key part of effective business management and survival. You will never have a plan that absolutely deals with every aspect that is 100% accurate. So planning, but also supported by some capability to adapt and be flexible and manage the situation on an ongoing basis. The more you've got right in your plan, the easier and faster you'll be able to put things into play, so you can then just focus on the things that that plan hasn't quite dealt with. So a lot of stuff going on. You therefore need to concentrate on the things that are really going to matter, because if you get those right, it will see you right overall. And the other stuff, it can just drift along in the background, not mattering too much, and you can pick those things up as and when the time is right. So I'll put down on this slide a few key areas that you really need to focus on, the things that really matter. So employees first. I mean, if you have a business and it's running now, you will be employing people in order to be able to perform the operations of that business. If you're currently dormant but are wanting to get your business up and running again, you will need some people in the future in order to be able to run that business. Now, Kelly's quite rightly touched on employee redundancy as being a key topic, because the sort of forecasts that we're seeing in terms of the economy and the future marketplace as the lockdown easing occurs over the months ahead are suggesting that the market is going to be quite fragile, vulnerable, and subject to rapid change. And the numbers of people that a business has employed previously may now be in excess of what they might need immediately in the future as we roll out and some of the government support schemes start to disappear, and therefore the furlough is no longer an option for us. So it's something you need to think about and face up to. So there are two aspects. One is really concentrating on, just as Kelly's already outlined, looking after the people that you've got, their safety, their well-being, and giving them all of the tools and equipment and support and communications they're going to need to be able to effectively deal with running the business for the future. But where you may have a surplus of employees, then to follow with the appropriate support and guidance the employment law processes that enable you to go through effective consultation and manage the surplus in numbers of people that a business may currently employ. That can create a tremendous amount of stress and problems, and Rachel will be following my presentation to talk to you in quite some detail about the mental health and well-being of people, particularly in these quite difficult and traumatic times. So an excellent presentation with some really good insight that is well worth continuing to tune into. Employees, really big part of moving the business forward, a whole load of challenges associated with that, as indeed are critical processes. So these are the things that your business needs to be able to do if it's going to function properly. Now, some of these may need to be adapted and changed in terms of the new situation that we find ourselves in. Others may be legal requirements, and therefore those processes need to be followed regardless because of the legal requirement that you have to do that. So you need to look at these critical processes not just from an operational point of view and how you might need to adapt them so that they stay relevant, but also from a legal point of view so that you aren't then falling foul of the law and doing things that could leave the business exposed and vulnerable to some sort of follow-up or prosecution at a later time. Customers, the lifeblood of a business. Again, as we start to go into lockdown easing, you may need to keep a very close communication with those customers that you have to understand their circumstances and how the lockdown easing may have an impact on them, the sort of support, services, products that they might need. And if you are a key supplier to them, to communicate with them in a way that they have confidence that you will be able to continue to support them and supply to them in a way that their businesses can function, because they're not going to want to go off into the marketplace only to find that they make a series of commitments and you let them down. So really, really important that you keep a close understanding into what their situations are so that you can work with them in order to be able to do that. And if you haven't been having those conversations with them one way or another, you really need to start thinking about how you can have that with a view to being better prepared for when things start to change and suddenly you're needing to get your business up on its feet again and supporting you and the employees that you've got. And that front end of the business is critically important, but so are all of the other aspects that wrap around it. So in the same way that you need to be a good supplier to your customers, you need your suppliers to be able to operate in exactly the same way that you're supporting your customers. So what is their situation and how resilient are they and what levels of support might they be able to provide to you so that you can rely on them to give you what you need in order for you to be able to operate and support your customer base. So that whole supply chain needs to really be properly understood. And those other agencies and organisations that are part of that or supporting that, those stakeholders, those organisations that have an interest in your business, whether they're creditors, banks, other finance organisations, shareholders, whoever they might be. So you just need to break down the business into these really critically important areas and have a little look at each one in turn, so that you can then start to get a feel for what might be required in terms of the type of activities that you might need to be adapting to and changing, so that you're going to be fit for whatever the situation that may arise in the future is going to be. So on the next slide, Paul. Thank you. What we're seeing is massive uncertainty associated with the future, and some little time ago the government tried to at least put some steps in place to create a framework for how that uncertainty could be managed. And while they were unwilling or unable a few weeks ago to put a detailed roadmap together, wanting to keep their message focused on people staying at home and a lid on the spread of the virus, they set in place 5 key tests, which are the ones that I've identified on this slide, to help guide them through what might be a very uncertain process. Now, we've got a roadmap coming which hopefully will provide a little bit more detail, but I suspect that that will still be somewhat high level in terms of the sort of steps that it might suggest. Not only that, but I think it may very well be one which is conditional on what sort of events and situations start to roll out, with the roadmap being tweaked and tuned and revised and adjusted and reshaped, so as to stay on course, and that will be done against the key tests that we've identified. So what might be a very useful thing for you to do is to adopt a similar sort of approach. So what are those key tests that you might want to be establishing to help guide you in the future for the things that are going to be important for you to do? So if we take this number 1, make sure that the NHS can cope, because these 5 are all really about containing the virus, stopping its spread, and looking after public health. Why don't we sort of reconfigure those to look at the health of the business? So in terms of make sure that the NHS can cope, one of the tests that you as a business owner might be looking at is make sure that you understand the nature of the market and that it's viable to start trading straight away. Because if that market just simply isn't there yet, because you happen to be in an area or a sector where the lockdowns are still continuing, and it's not going to be beneficial for you to put a whole load of money into getting yourself up and running again, only to find that that market just has not come back on stream. So have a little think about the tests that you might want to set for your business that will help to guide you through the uncertain times, so that you've got something that you can refer to that will help you in your decision making and provide you with that little bit more stability and structure in terms of moving forward. And next slide, please. So business continuity planning is simply a means, a structured means by which you can look at what sort of situations may arise in the future, the impact that they might have, and what you might want to do about them early enough for you to make a difference and either prevent them from happening or at least reduce the impact that they might have. Now, if we are to sort of assume that currently we're in that calm before the storm, I think we're going to learn that lockdown was the easy thing. Getting out of lockdown is going to be a highly complex, challenging and difficult process that is going to run off at a pace that is going to be really difficult to manage. So if we can use the time that we've got now to step back and just fundamentally have a little look at some of these critical areas of the business. So if we start to look at sort of the threats, the things that could do some damage to the business, and one area might all be around employee welfare. So what are the things that we need to do in order to make sure our employees are safe? Could be a super heading of which achieving social distancing, surface contamination, PPE, all of those sorts of things are individual threats that might have a contribution towards that whole management of people. Another area might be appropriate financial resources. So lack of money in the business, difficulty acquiring loans or funding, poor credit, you know, how might those manifest themselves as threats to the business? And the withdrawal of government schemes in the future and the importance for the business to at least generate an income itself. Aspects of the market that might be changing, and suppliers that may have been lost that damage the supply chain. So step back and fundamentally put under these category groups the sort of threats that you believe might be appropriate that your business could experience in this uncertain time that's coming ahead. And then have a little look at the impact associated with each of them. What's the extent and the nature of the damage? What functions of the business might they impact, and how critical is that? And what sort of speed might need to do to recover them? So that you can then ask yourself the question, so what can I do to either prevent it, or if you're unable to prevent it, to deal with it, and what sort of resources might you need for that? So those are the three sort of steps in terms of what we're wanting you to do. Step back, what are the risks, what are the threats, what impact are they likely to have, and what can we do about it? So on the next slide, I can just sort of introduce you to the planning process itself. So it tends to be in 5 stages. The details of this you can look up in ISO 22301. So the first step is the analysis. That's what we've just been really fundamentally talking about. Identifying those threats, the impact associated with them, and drawing up a list of requirements, things that you might need to change, those adaptations in your business. And from those, once you've got them prioritized out, really focused on the things that matter, and you can build them up over a period of time. You don't have to do them all in one go. You can sort of, you know, take a couple of days out to just look at the market, a couple of days out to look at the finance, really sort of start to get those things shaped up. Once you've got that, what you can then do is move to the second stage, which is solution design. Don't forget, the first idea of a solution isn't always the best one. So play around with a few ideas, see what you can come up with, and choose the best one from them. So we're fundamentally looking for solutions to prevent, and if you're unable to prevent, then what's that recovery cure? I'll just put my power on. Get that sort of thing done, get it into a spreadsheet, and then get some of those ideas put into place, and the resources that you're going to need to support them acquired and ready. What you then need to do is test it out, get everybody familiar in the workplace with it, so that there's an understanding and things can drop into place and people understand why. And that final stage is just keeping on top of it. So as things keep changing, then to be able to make tweaks to it so that the solutions that you've come up with and their implementations remain effective. So 5 simple little steps can make a phenomenal difference to your ability to deal with whatever might come at you in the future. On the final slide, just really sort of pulling out those key priorities. So to summarize all of that and pick up a lot of the stuff that already has been covered with Peter, Mike and Kelly earlier, Prioritise people's safety and continuous engagement, obviously in the context of looking at the number of people you need. Communicate with your customers and the relevant stakeholders so everybody knows what's happening and how it's going to affect them. Adapt and reshape your strategy to be able to have a business that is fit for purpose for whatever the future might hold, and building that resilience into it. And maximise the use of the government schemes that are available to you now. They're not going to be there forever, so you really need to take advantage of them now whilst you can. And just on that topic, if we have a look at the very final slide, which is just briefly touching on some of the support schemes that are available through the Humber Business Growth Hub. Best thing for you to do really is to go on site. So it's humbergrowthhub.org. If you look under the Covid-19 webpage, you'll see a variety of different support schemes, some of which are just on this slide, in terms of an ICT grant that can help in terms of setting up working from home, planning, consultancy support, a grant to help you access expertise and specialists like myself in order to help companies to get their plans in place and implemented. Some finance for growth support. There's a small business grant fund which is available through the councils. A lot of that's already now in place, all complementing the national scheme of funding that has been mentioned before. So massive amount available there. There's an excellent group of business support advisors. If you go on site, look at the council region that you're in and select business advisors, you can then speak to, free of charge, the business support team or a business support advisor who can help you move things forward. So good luck with it. Get on with your plans, and I wish you the very best for the future. Over to you, Paul.
That's great. Thanks very much once again, Steve. And Steve has an amazing ability to be able to weed through the theory of how you're supposed to run your business and structure it or restructure it and survive and thrive and get to the real practical elements of support required. So a massive thank you again, Steve. And for the rest of the audience, we hope to be scheduling very, very soon through the Humber Growth Hub a series of workshops to build on what Steve said, to help you practically with some of the elements he's discussed today to rebuild your business and to get it back to whatever normal is going to look like moving forward. So we look forward from hearing from Steve again next week and in the future. Now passing you straight on to the final presentation of the day is over to Rachel to talk about mental health with that greatest asset that any business can have, their staff. Over to you, Rachel.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, everybody. Today I'm going to talk to you about how to protect the mental health of your workforce now in lockdown and then coming out of lockdown. So there's going to be a lot of fear of staff going back into the workplace and looking at how we can help manage them, how we can help manage that fear with your staff. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. It's slightly different from previous presentations. So if you have listened to previous presentations, this will go into a little bit more depth about how to facilitate that process of managing the mental health of yourself and of your employees. So the next slide, please, Paul. So what we're going to look at is why is focusing on mental health so important right now, how to have the mental health conversation, and also how to manage mental health in yourself, because we need to keep you as a business owner, as a manager, as a leader in you know, absolutely at the prime of your managing your own mental health so that you can manage your employees' mental health. So those are three things we're going to look at today. Okay, so if you take one thing from this presentation, I'd love it to be this, that your workforce is your most important asset. And I think often we can get very sort of like focused on the idea that our customers are our most important assets. But actually, if we didn't have our own staff, then who is doing the work? You know, who is creating that profit for us? Who is making that money? And so when I go into organisations to work with them to improve the mental health of their employees, I talk a lot about your staff are your internal customers, so we have to make sure that they are operating at their peak performance. And if they're starting to suffer with mental health, then what it means is they haven't got the ability to focus on their job, to fulfill their job role to the best of their ability. So a lot of people think that mental health is just about stress, anxiety, depression, and it's not at all. That is not what mental health is about. Mental health, if we go on to the next slide, Paul. Mental health is so linked to these 4 areas, and this is why it's so important. So yes, now in COVID it's important, but going forward after this it's equally as important. And the companies that bring me in to work with them know that if they can get the mental health of their staff right, then they benefit in the bottom line. There is such a high return on investment. So it's a win-win. Not only are we helping staff be happier, but it's helping our business be more successful. So these are the 4 reasons why you as an employer, as a business owner, as a manager need to be really focusing on mental health. First of all, business productivity. There are clear research and papers written showing that when we focus on the mental health of our staff, we see a direct result of productivity. So staff are more engaged, there's less presenteeism, and we have increased productivity. So this is why companies now are bringing in people like myself to help them understand about mental health in their business. Of course, as a manager, we have a legal responsibility to look after the mental health of our staff. And it's not as in-depth as some people think. Basically, it's just be able to recognize some basic signs and symptoms of mental health, but more importantly, know how to intervene. That's what we need to do. That's where our duty of care is. How can I help you prevent or manage this mental health, and be able to know where to signpost? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. Of course, a leader's role is to empower, so it's very much down to the responsibility of the staff member to manage their own mental health, and I'm going to cover that in the talk. So if we can empower our team to look after their own mental health, then that is a magnificent place to be, but we need to educate them how to do that. And you know, number 4, understandably, it's because it's the right thing to do. Helping your staff manage their mental health is the right thing to do. 73% of employees think it actually is a manager's role to recognise and address the stress and anxiety in the workplace. So there is an expectation from our staff that is the manager's role, and that can feel quite overwhelming to a manager, but actually it doesn't need to be, and I'm going to talk to you about how to manage that going forward. Next slide, please, Paul. So research was done via the CIPD, and they actually took a proportion of employees and researched a proportion of employees that were struggling with their mental health. And they said, okay, well, how does mental health affect you from doing your job properly? And these are the stats that came out. They admitted there was a difficulty in concentrating, so how can they stay? They're not able to stay focused on the task in hand. It's taking them longer to do tasks than what it should be expected to do. They're struggling to make decisions, so if staff are struggling to make decisions, how is the task getting done? They have difficulty in juggling a number of tasks. Less patience with customers and clients, so clearly there your customer service is being affected. Putting off challenging work, and more likely to get into conflict with others. So I think we can quite clearly see from that when staff are struggling with mental health, it stops them from being able to do their job properly. And that's what we as business owners need to be looking at. How is your mental health stopping you from fulfilling your role and your responsibilities? Because that role and that responsibility fits into the bigger picture of this organisation being successful and hitting its targets. So I'm hoping that from now you can understand why it's so important to help staff manage their mental health. So going forward, please, Paul. So, you know, a lot of when I go into companies and complete a fact find and see what's going on around the mental health, there is often some resistance from senior leadership team or the board, and it's this fear of opening a can of worms. So if I start looking at this picture of mental health in my company, what kind of worms am I opening? And at the moment, it's just a lot easier to not even talk about mental health and not even go there. And I can understand that. I've been in the business for nearly 20 years now as a psychologist, so I can understand that there is a lot of fear around mental health, but there doesn't need to be. And hopefully, I'm gonna pop some of those myths today, and blow some of those myths about how do you have a conversation of mental health, and what's your responsibility, and what's the employee's responsibility. So talking mental health is not as scary as what you think it may be. And if you can see the benefits of talking from mental health, then what you'll see is this real difference in sort of the culture of your organization, how your employees view you as a manager, as a business owner, because what they're seeing is that you value them as a person, you value them as an individual, and it's not just somebody that can make so many widgets or answer so many calls. You're actually saying, I give a shit about you, I care about you, and that's what builds the engagement and reduces the presenteeism. So next slide, please, Paul. So this is all about helping employees to help you. How can I help you, Mrs. Employee, Mr. Employee, to fulfill your job properly so that then I can benefit from that and the tasks get done? So it's a win-win situation. We're helping the staff member be happier, have better mental health, but it's helping you achieve your business goals. Next slide, please, Paul. So, okay, so let's bring it back to COVID at the moment. So, there's a lot of different, I see as a therapist that a lot of people are dealing with COVID in a lot of different ways. I have clients that come that are quite chilled about it, that just are waiting for it to pass. And then I have other clients that come that are very concerned about what's happening and what's going to happen. But I see one thing is common in everybody that I'm seeing, all my clients, is that it's this uncertainty. And I think one thing that COVID is definitely giving all of us is some uncertainty. So if we look at the definition of uncertainty, what we see is it's the not known. It's when we can't rely on the future. We're not sure what's going to happen. And as humans, that's one thing we don't like. So next slide, please, Paul. So when we feel uncertain, and you'll know this yourself, that if you don't know what's going to happen in a certain situation, we can feel worried, we can feel angry, the tension builds, the pressure builds, we then start to feel overwhelmed, we can get scared, we can get panicky, we may start suffering with anxiety, we can get over emotional, and it can affect our sleep. And a lot of us have been conditioned in this society to then go see the GP and say, look, I'm feeling all these things and I don't know what to do about it. And the medical model is very much about, okay, well, we'll give you a tablet to manage that. We can give you some tablets to reduce how you're feeling. But actually that doesn't treat what the core symptoms are. And the core symptoms are that we think we can't handle the uncertainty. We're so fearful about the future. We think we can't handle whatever the future is going to bring. But there's no evidence that the future is going to bring bad things. But that's how our brains are wired. Our brains are wired to think of the worst case scenario. It's an evolutionary technique in us so that we're safe. So when we're feeling with all these things, and your staff will be going in this place now, a lot of them, it results in increased stress. So they'll be feeling stress, and therefore that makes them more fearful, which then brings more worry, more anger. So if we can help our staff manage that stress, reduce that stress, then again, we're going to benefit and they're going to benefit. So let's look at where stress comes from. So if we move forward, please, Paul. So the very, very simple diagram here. Basically, we have two parts of our brain. We have, as you can see, an emotional part of our brain. That's called the limbic system. And then we have a more resilient part of our brain, the thinking brain, as we can call it, the more rational thinking, the more strategic brain. So what can happen is when we get data that comes into us, whether it be by what we see, such as an email coming in, or what we hear on the news, what happens is the emotional brain within us has to process that straight away. So what it has to do is, if you like, pause the thinking brain, pause the rational brain to say, okay, I need to assess this situation that's happening, and I'm going to assess it via immersion. And the reason why we have to do that is there may be a need for an increase of adrenaline and cortisol to come into our body, because the emotional brain wants to say, am I at risk here? Am I at danger here? And if there's a slight chance that we think we're at risk or we think we're at danger, then our body needs to be flooded with this adrenaline and cortisol to be able to make us run away, to be able to make us to, you know, stand and freeze, or to fight. So this goes back to the times of the saber-toothed tiger on the plains of Africa. Now, the trouble with our brains is it doesn't know, if you like, whether we're sort of like fighting that tiger or whether that email from our boss or our partner or whatever, it can't really sense the difference. So it still has to assess it on immersion. And that's where the fear comes from, and that's where the stress comes from. So at the root of a lot of people's stress is this idea of, I don't think I can handle what's going to come. I don't think I know, you know, how I'm going to manage, and therefore we get scared because the adrenaline and the cortisol comes. So what we need to do is learn ways to be able to, if you like, calm that emotional brain down, and to be able to access the resilient brain, the more thinking brain, the more strategic brain. And that's where you come in as a business owner, as a manager. You're going to facilitate that process of helping your staff that may not be as emotionally aware as you or as intellectual as you. You're going to give them a space to be able to press pause on the emotional brain and access that resilient brain. So what does that look like? How do we do that? Go forward, please, Paul. So we need to understand about stress, and the great thing about stress is that it's all about perception. So this is the definition of stress, or one definition of stress. There's many definitions of stress. So stress is the perceived demands placed upon me versus my perceived ability to handle the demands. So because I've been, for example, standing up for many years in front of groups and facilitating training courses, the thought of doing a training course and public speaking does not cause me stress, because I know that I have the ability to handle that demand. Yet for many people who have to stand up and do a talk, it causes them immense stress. And so we can see that it's their perceived ability to be able to handle that demand. So a lot of our staff get stressed, but it's all in their perception of what they think they can handle. So if we take the example of a lot of people having to work from home, that will have created a lot of stress, because for some people, they won't have believed that they could handle the demand of working from home, because it was different to what they were expecting. However, what will have happened over the last couple of weeks, they will have got used to it. So we can see that their ability to be able to handle those demands will have increased. Therefore, the stress will have reduced. So you might say to me, okay, well, Rachel, what's the point of this? Well, what you need is a workforce who has the ability to withstand changes in whatever environment is coming. So like Kelly touched on, you know, there is some, there are going to be some changes that you're going to have to make for this new environment. And so if we can reduce the stress for the staff, then that's going to help the staff be able to focus on the job, because remember, that resilient brain, that strategic brain is going to still be able to operate, because the emotional brain is not as stressed. So it's not overwhelming the individual with a load of cortisol and adrenaline. So employees with stress or poor mental health, basically all that means is they're thinking and feeling and behaving in a way which means it's causing them problems, and therefore they're unable to concentrate on the task in hand. And if they're unable to concentrate on the task in hand, then they are a risk to your organisation, a financial risk to your organisation. So if we can help them reduce that stress, then their thinking capacities are going to be able to go up, which means they can focus on the job in hand. So I want to stress again, guys, that mental health is just not, you know, depression, anxiety, bipolar, suicide. That is just an aspect of mental health. Helping your staff to be able to think, feel and behave in an awesome way means that they are able to do their job properly. And that's what I really wanted to get from this presentation. Okay, if we can go forward, please, Paul. So let's look at what your responsibility is in managing others. So it's quite clear really that there are responsibilities for the manager and the responsibilities for the employee. So let's look at the employees. It is the employee's responsibility to look at what is causing them stress in their home life. That is their responsibility. Now, if they come and tell you that, maybe they said, you know what, I've been in COVID and I've realised that my marriage isn't the best thing, so I'm actually going to now start to go down the divorce route. It's not for you to solve that problem, but it's best practice for you to understand what may be causing them stress and what you can do as an employer to be able to make that process easier. So, you know, okay, do you need to go see a solicitor? Do you need to take some phone calls? Let's have a little action plan of what we can do. Because if you can prevent their stress from getting worse from something that's happening in their home life, then you're going to benefit from it. So dealing with home life pressures, taking care of their physical, mental, emotional well-being, being honest with you. So if there's anybody out there listening to this that is an employer, you know, be honest with your employer about the stress that you're feeling, because only then they can do something about it. You know, when you speak to any HR professional, what they say when it's gone as far as the tribunal route is, you know, if you had just dealt with this, Mr. or Mrs. Employer, in the early days, this wouldn't have gone so far. We could have resolved this at an earlier point. So if employees are open to receiving professional support, listening to you as a manager and what you're suggesting, then they're able to take responsibility for their mental health. So that's very much why I say it's up to an employee to look after their own mental health. So your responsibility is having a conversation with mental health. I'm going to show you how to do that. Helping to manage workload, offering support, being flexible, like the example I gave about the divorce, offering adjustments. If it comes under the Equality Act, if a mental health is classed as a disability, then you have to offer adjustments. But if it doesn't, then you don't have to. But of course, best practice is to offer as many adjustments as you can, where feasible, meeting the business needs. Signposting, I'm going to give you an example of how you signpost. Following up, and I've just put on here being comfortable with your emotions, because clearly when you start asking staff about mental health, they may get upset, they may get angry. It's nothing to be scared about. You don't have to solve that tear, solve those tears, solve that upset. You just have to be okay with that. If you go forward, please, Paul. Okay, the quicker you take steps to manage the mental health in others, then the quicker that the issues will get sorted. And you know, you're in such a powerful position here, guys, because you might be the only person that's actually caring about the well-being. I go into that a lot more when I facilitate workshops about, you know, helping others, because it's the right thing to do. Move forward, please, Paul. Okay, so 4-step process. So this is what you really need to be thinking about now, going back into the workplace or starting to come out of lockdown. How can I bring mental health into the arena at the moment, because it's so important, because there are going to be people that are worried about going back into the workplace. So it's a 4-step process. So we're going to start with step 1, create an awareness of mental health. So go forward, please, Paul. So how do you raise awareness? Really simply, you're just going to do it. So, you know, you might send out an email, or you might do a team Zoom meeting, and you might say, right, we're going to talk about mental health, because going back into the workplace, this is so important. When you get back into the workplace, you might create awareness about mental health through notice boards, through team meetings, through charity events. And it's about looking at who else in your organisation can be involved in that. So it doesn't have to be you as the business owner. There might be a staff member that's really passionate about mental health, because they may have struggled with mental health. So, you know, bring other people from your organisation to help manage this and push this forward. Ask yourself, what outcomes do I hope to achieve by raising awareness? So you might get a little staff focus group going on about, okay, well, this is clearly a scary time, guys, so how can we help all our employees manage the mental health during this time? Remember, you are not an expert. All you're doing is simply raising awareness about mental health. There are enough therapists out there, enough counsellors out there, enough psychologists like me out there who are able to go down the rabbit hole and help these people in detail with their mental health. That's not your job. Your job is just to raise the awareness. So start to think, how can I create awareness going back into the workplace? What would that look like? Next slide, please, Paul. Next step is quite simply have the conversation. You know,
darling. You can have them and I'll have yours.
Oh, I can hear some of the other talking going on. So step 2, have the conversation. I noticed that you've been a little bit sad recently and wondered how you are. How are you feeling? You seem a little down. And this can be as a team event. You know, it's like, okay, guys, on a scale of 0 to 10, how are we feeling? 10 sort of like is pretty stressed. 0 is, you know, I'm absolutely fine. And just take a temperature check. It can be as simple as that. You could have a flip chart up in the office, you know, with a scale on, and just get people to put post-it notes on with a smiley face or a sad face. It's as simple as that. So, you know, part of my role, guys, is to look at the demands being placed upon you right now, and I wondered if you'd like to give me some feedback. You know, we don't seem to have laughed much recently. How are you feeling about work at the moment? Even just saying on a team brief, you know, okay, how are we feeling about coming back into work? Are we feeling stressed about it? You're going to get all this really valuable intel from your team. We're going to look at step 3. So once we've got all this valuable intel from how our team are feeling, are they feeling stressed? Are they feeling okay? What are they, you know, what is the perception of COVID? One of my fears is there's going to be a lot of different belief systems going on in the workplace. So I personally am not all that, I've not sort of bought into all the fear about COVID. So if I was in a workplace, I'd be pretty chilled about it. But I can see that there's a lot of people out there that are very fearful about COVID. So straight away, there would be some tension in the workplace if you've got one person that does want to socially distance and another person that's not really social distancing. So we need to have action, we need to have boundaries, we need to have guidelines. So ask yourself some questions. What do we need to do as an organisation to help you manage this situation? So can you see, guys, you are not telling them what you need to do, you're asking them, what is it you want? What will help you right now? What do you need to do to manage this situation? So again, ask them the question. So you're going to say, right, this is what we're going to do as an organisation. What are you going to do to manage the situation of what's causing you stress? How will we know if we are starting to struggle going back into the workplace? You know, what's the early warning triggers of that if I'm starting to feel stress? And what 3 actions can each of us take to manage this situation better? So you're going to take responsibilities of the organisation to say, this is what I commit to reduce the stress of going back into the workplace. But what are you going to commit to? What can you do to reduce the stress? Step 4. And it's very important that if you commit to asking these questions and having the mental health conversation, that you review it and follow up. So when shall we review this, guys? Let's put it in the diary. Week next Tuesday, great. Anything else that anybody wants to share right now which they feel is important around stress, mental health, and how happy are you with the outcome of this conversation? So this is really good to do on a one-to-one, or it's really good to do as a team conversation. And this is one of my favourite quotes. People will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And I can see personally myself with friends that I'm talking to, they are seeing how their employer is dealing with this situation, and some of them are saying, you know what, I'm going to look for another job after this because they've treated me absolutely terrible. But then there's other people saying, God, they've been so good, you know, amazing, they've done this, that and the other. So, you know, if you can help your staff feel safe, feel less stressed, feel certain about that you're there to help them, that's when the engagement comes, and that's when the productivity rises and the presenteeism is reduced. Next slide, please, Paul. Okay, so, you know, very important in that your thinking creates your stress. So there's going to be a lot of thinking out there from your teams that is creating the stress. So that's what we're asked by asking the question, how are you feeling right now? What's going on for you right now about maybe coming back into work? You're going to get the thinking from them, what they're worried about, and then that gives you an action plan of how you can reduce that worry for them as a manager. Next slide, please, Paul. Just speeding it up a little bit because I'm aware of the time. Have realistic expectations going back into the workplace. So, you know, again, have the conversation. What are we expecting our staff to do when they get back into that workplace? Is it reasonable to expect them to do that? And let me check that out with the staff. Does this sound reasonable, what we're asking you to do? It's all about openness. It's all about transparency. Next slide, please, Paul. And look at, you know, even for yourself, look at how can you balance your stress at the moment. So look at, you know, how am I resting? How am I playing? You know, how am I calming that emotional brain down? Am I effectively coming off emails at a good time? You know, am I effectively taking some time out? And it's not just about collapsing in front of Netflix with a bottle of wine. That's not often the most effective. It's about being able to disengage your mind in a productive way. Next slide, please, Paul. And look at, like we've just said, how are you effective relaxing? Ask your staff, how do you relax on a night? It's so important to be able to rest and relax and recuperate. And what could happen after this COVID is that a lot of people have been on high alert, they've been on fight or flight for so long that when it's over, that's when the trauma, if you like, the fear starts to really come out and it can be affecting them. So again, it's important to have conversations about how are we going to manage that. Next slide, please, Paul. Okay, so we're summary. So focusing on mental health is so important for yourself right now. So you go through that 4-step process for yourself and check into your own mental health and what do you need right now and what will make it safe for you. Have the courage to have the mental health conversation and be able to prioritise your mental health. So regarding the signposting, I don't know where the slide's gone, but regarding the signposting, you know, it's about being able to prioritise your staff even and send them to either like a knock health or, you know, a counsellor or a coach or somebody that can help them manage their stress if you feel that there's nothing that you can do to help them in the sense of you can't change work demands, you're not getting involved in the home demands. You know, don't be afraid to suggest that, you know, they go to the GP, but they ask the GP for some sort of counselling or therapy rather than just going on the medication, because that's not often the right route out there. So if you've got any questions, guys, please come into the chat and ask. I will be doing another talk tomorrow at 2:30 via the Humber Business Growth about how to manage your mental health. So that's 2 hours for you just to focus on your mental health as just a human rather than an employee. So if you want to know more about how to keep you strong, then sign up for that tomorrow. It's 2:30 tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for that presentation. I do apologise for those that did get some sort of disruption with the audio throughout that. If you did experience that, I do apologise. However, this session will be recorded and hosted on the Growth Hub website. So for anyone that did experience any issues, you can always download that video or watch it, view it from their website, probably from tomorrow onwards. Okay, well, thank you very much to all our presenters today. I think we've had several really useful presentations with some very practical support. We have had a few questions come in, so I'm going to run through some of these now, if that's okay. If I can ask our presenters to join us again. Thank you. Okay, so the first question we have, in fact, the first couple of questions we have, I think, are relating to Kelly. Kelly, what happens if you take somebody off furlough, but they refuse because of social distancing concerns? So, for example, they might be living with a high-risk member of the family. Do they have any right to refuse coming back out of furlough?
It really depends. So if they're living with somebody who has a shielding letter and that person is shielding and they're potentially a carer, then you could use the furlough scheme if it's still there. If it's not and somebody is just frightened, so I've actually had a client with this sort of similar situation where they've had a staff member who doesn't want to come back to work, and it's purely because they have somebody they feel is vulnerable rather than they've actually received a shielding letter. The bottom line is the contract of employment still comes into play. Obviously, you need to handle it with a little bit of care. So you don't really want to dive in disciplining people because they're refusing to come to work, but what you should do is really kind of have a conversation and explore the reasons why. Really start to understand, okay, why is it that this person doesn't want to come to work? Are there measures that you can put in place to make them feel better and safer about coming to work? And if there isn't, and they're still adamant they don't want to come to work, are there then other things that you could potentially do? So offer them unpaid leave, offer them to take holiday. You know, there are other practical types of things that you can do to support them in this time frame, because, you know, I think a lot of people are going to feel that fear initially of coming back to work. So it is just making sure that they feel secure and that you do have measures in place.
Right, and I can see Rachel nodding her head throughout that. I assume you agree with that, Rachel? Anything you'd add to that, or is that?
Yeah, I totally agree, and it's really going back to what I was talking about there about the adjustments that can be made. But I think what's important to realise is that there's a business need as well as managing the personal need, isn't there? So it's about making sure that, like Kelly said, we're going to try and support you and help you as much as possible. But then at the end of the day, if there's no risks as such, then the business does still need to operate. So it's fine line, isn't it, of balancing both. So yeah, totally agree. Good question, actually. I think a lot of employees will be suffering with that.
So from a process perspective, I assume that shielding letter is the first thing to check, is it, Kelly? That's the first thing to
really explore, with the individual. And this is really, all of this is going to come down to sitting and talking to people. We need to kind of get in touch with the human side here. At the end of the day, people are frightened. That's the reality of this situation. So it's really sitting down and really understanding, what the state of play is, and this vulnerable person, have they received a shielding letter? And then if they have, it's really what's their home setup? Who else is in the home? Are there any way that when this person comes from work and to work, can they put measures in place? So I know a lot of my friends are nurses, for example, and they will go to work. When they come home, they go straight into a bathroom, they change their clothes, they wash, they put on fresh clothes before they then go into sort of contact with their family. So there are lots of measures that can be put into place even if somebody is shielding. So it's really just understanding, those individual circumstances, because it's going to be different for everybody. And then once you've kind of understood, okay, what is that individual circumstance, it's then what can you do from there on in. But it's going to be about finding compromise and that balance of kind of the business need and the individual's need.
Absolutely. That's great. Thank you.
I think, Paul, if I can just come in there, I think this is where, when I gave the stress definition, it's the perceived demands that are being placed upon them. So Kelly's quite right, there's a fear there. It's their perception of that something terrible is going to happen, or that the future is uncertain. So this might be an example where if the employee is still not sort of like giving up on that fear, they say, well, I tell you what, why don't we go why don't you go see a coach, or why don't we just get somebody to chat to you that's not as close to the business, that it's somebody impartial. So I know that if I had somebody like that come to see me, I would be absolutely trying to get and root down to the perceptions and what are the fears. And because I'm impartial, then I'm able to sort of like do that. So, it might be a time when they can signpost out to a third party who is more able to help them manage the fear and help them see that actually in reality, is there anything to be fearful about? A lot of the news that you watch, I don't actually watch a lot of the news because it's so fear-based, and it's trying to sort of like get people sort of like a lot of fear of all sort of like, round up with fear. So if people are isolated at home and they're not with anybody that's just got that ability to critically think and just sort of like look at the stats and think, yeah, hang on a minute, then they're isolated in that bubble. So getting them out of that place to see a third party might just help them shift into a more positive frame of mind.
Great, thank you very much. I'm just going to go on to the next question now. It's quite a specific question, I think, again, from an employment law perspective, Kelly. Somebody has an employee that was placed on furlough as of the 1st of April, and then maternity leave was due and commenced on the 20th of April. Which takes priority in terms of employee rights, and what do you think that business should be doing to support?
The maternity leave should take precedent, purely because, with regards to pay, somebody who's on maternity leave would be entitled to 90% of their earnings for the first 6 weeks. So that would take precedent. They're then also entitled to, a year off and all the benefits that go along with that. So family-friendly leaves, maternity, paternity, etc., takes precedent over furlough.
That's great. Thank you very much. I'm just having a look through the question log to see what else we have here. In terms of going back into the workplace, as we may well be doing then, probably a question initially for Rachel, but I guess for anybody to answer. What do you think the biggest worries are going to be of employees, and how do you think we should be dealing with that? What kind of support do you think we should be dealing with?
I think we can I think there'll be loads of worries, fear of that they're gonna pick it up and that they're gonna have it, that's probably gonna be a big fear. But I think this is why it's so important to have that mental health conversation right from the start. Start having it now, even if it's like by SurveyMonkey, and setting some questions on there to ask the staff about what are your fears going forward, what can we do as an organisation to help you. I think it's like Steve said, that if we can prepare for it, and we can be aware of what might happen. And the only way we can do that is to ask them questions, is to get that data. So start to have the questions now, instead of us all trying to be psychic and trying to work out what are they going to be fearful of. Ask the question. They're gonna know themselves, and then what that does is give us this amazing data and intel that then we can put an action plan together and say, okay, this is what we need to be aware of. Okay, we're going to close the canteen, like Kelly said, or we're going to make sure there's more car parking spaces. Ask the staff the fears. They know what they're fearful of, and then take that intel and then make your changes, or then look at what you can do to help them. That would be my suggestion.
Anybody else got anything to add to that? That was quite a thorough response.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with all of that. I think it's absolutely right. The more you can engage them, you're coming across as interested in them, you're coming across as being more caring, you're taking the time out to ask the questions, which shows that you see them and that issue as a priority. It's all good relationship building, but smart, intelligent business management. I think what Rachel said is absolutely right.
Correct. Well, I think that. Oh, sorry, Peter, go on.
The only thing I would add there is give them some information as well when you ask the question, because if you said, well, what are you most fearful of? Then they need something to base on how they're going to come back to work and what they're going to be doing to the best of your knowledge. So if you kind of said, well, we're going to be closing the canteen, we're going to be doing social distancing, you're going to be not having hot desks, what are you most fearful of? Those items have already been dealt with, and they have a bit of an idea of what they're talking about with the questions. The question is more specific than just a general, what are you most fearful of, because you'll get all sorts of answers in that one.
And just one point for businesses, which is, I've quoted a figure of over 80% of people really reluctant to go into a pub or a restaurant, a place of business. It's your customers as well that need to feel welcome in your workplace if you are in retailing or hospitality. And it's a perception. It's the perception that they'll have to get over something pretty substantial. Longer as weeks go by, every week will make that more difficult, and more effort will have to be put into making people feel comfortable, making customers feel comfortable in returning to places of business.
And I think we'll know more about the framework, or roadmap as it's being called, on Sunday. We'll start to get a little bit more detail from that. As I mentioned before, moving forward, there will be further workshops being provided through the Growth Hub with some of our presenters involved today. You'll be able to book onto these workshops to understand how you can take practical steps that will address some of these issues. Remote working from home, protecting your employees, protecting yourself and your customers. And yet still trying to get your business to run operationally and effectively. These are the kind of things we'll be looking at in the coming weeks and months, no doubt, through the Growth Hub, through these workshops. So just a reminder to everybody to keep abreast of all the events that are coming up, please visit the growmysme.co.uk/events webpage hosted by the Growth Hub. You'll find these events that you'll find us speaking on, and other organisations providing business support as well. So there's a wide range of support available through the Growth Hub. So please keep checking that weekly, if not daily, to see what other types of support you could access that could help you and your business. And just a reminder to everybody to also, on the Growth Hub website, visit the Covid-19 page that covers everything that we've talked about today in terms of national and local business support and all the other support that's available. A lot of people don't often take up the support. I've got to say, my 18 years of experience, sometimes when support is free or funded, people don't see a value in it. But I have to say, having worked with the specialist providers today on today's workshop, and knowing the other presenters and advisors that are available across the Humber region, there is a lot of practical support, not just theory-based support, but practical support that's available that will really help you answer and give you the right answer to the right question at the right time at the moment for you. So yeah, plenty of support available. For those that are interested, this session will be running again next week. You can book on through the website and secure your place. We'll be joined again next week by Stella Jacobs to give us some more cybersecurity and data protection updates and generally good business advice relating to that. Don't forget to check your passwords, as we mentioned at the start of the session today. And other than that, I hope you have a good rest of the week and stay safe, and hopefully see you next week. Thank you very much.